In the rolling hills of Henrio County, Virginia, where endless stretches of tobacco fields swayed like emerald waves beneath the summer sun of 1784, the Caldwell family presided over one of the most thriving plantations in the Commonwealth. To neighbors and visitors alike, they stood as exemplars of post-revolutionary society, wealthy, cultured, and profoundly devout. Yet concealed behind the walls of Millhaven Estate was a secret so horrifying that when it emerged in the winter of 1789, it sent tremors through the very core of Virginia's upper class. Court documents from that era, sealed for more than 200 years, unveil a narrative woven with calculated deceit, forged records, and the chilling revelation of a young woman who learned she had been groomed from childhood for a purpose so dark it defied imagination. 23 witnesses gave testimony so harrowing that 3 judges withdrew from the case, citing moral incapacity to preside. Officials attempted to suppress the truth, the church denied any knowledge, and the remaining family members fled Virginia, never to return. But as always, the truth eventually rose to the surface. Before diving into the tale of Elizabeth Hartwell and the Caldwell family's forbidden legacy, I want you to know that this channel is devoted to uncovering the darkest, most unsettling real stories from America's past. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you never miss one of our weekly explorations into history's most haunting mysteries. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? I love seeing where our community of mystery enthusiasts is tuning in from across the nation. The scandal's surviving documents remained hidden in the basement of Richmond's courthouse until 1892, when a clerk accidentally unearthed them while organizing old records. His report to the Virginia Historical Society described the material as too disturbing for the public, and the files were sealed again for another half-century. The story begins in the fall of 1776, when Virginia was still reeling from the turbulence of revolution and the promise of newfound independence. Millhaven Estate, covering nearly 3,000 acres of rich tobacco soil, had belonged to the Caldwell family for 3 generations. The original land grant, signed by Governor Alexander Spotswood in 1722, had placed the family among the colonial elite, a status they maintained through strategic marriages, sharp business acumen, and a steadfast dedication to preserving their fortune and standing. The patriarch, Jonathan Caldwell, was a man of immense influence, a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses before the Revolution, a tobacco trader with networks reaching from Richmond to London, and a widower whose wife, Catherine, had died during childbirth just months before the Declaration of Independence. At 42, Jonathan carried an imposing authority. Men listened when he spoke, and women averted their gaze when he passed. Tall, with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples and piercing steel-gray eyes, he embodied the essence of power. His late wife hailed from the esteemed Harrison family, among Virginia's earliest settlers, tracing their lineage back to Jamestown. Catherine Harrison Caldwell had brought both immense wealth and impeccable social status to their union, elevating the Caldwell name to the pinnacle of colonial society. Their marriage, though short-lived, became a centerpiece of Richmond's social gossip, uniting 2 dominant tobacco dynasties. The war disrupted established trade networks, but also opened unprecedented opportunities for those sharp enough to adapt. Jonathan was among the first planters to grasp that the new nation required fresh sources of wealth, alliances, and strategies to maintain influence. Unlike many of his peers who clung to loyalty to the crown out of tradition, Jonathan sided with the revolution, not out of idealism but calculation. He understood that independence would reshape laws, courts, and opportunities for men capable of exploiting them. His gamble proved shrewd. While other planters floundered in wartime chaos, Jonathan secured French trade deals through Philadelphia connections. When currency collapsed, he demanded payment in golden deeds. As other estates plunged into debt, Millhaven thrived, expanding through the purchase of neighboring lands at wartime discounts. But immense wealth brought new burdens. Lacking a male heir, Jonathan faced the grim possibility of his estate being fragmented among distant relatives upon his death, a fate his grandfather, the original Jonathan Caldwell, had warned against in letters still kept in the family strongbox. The elder Caldwell had predicted many things accurately: the primacy of land, the sanctity of bloodlines, and the unbreakable need to keep family wealth intact. A fortune divided is a fortune destroyed. he had written in his final letter. Ensure the Caldwell name and lands remain united, no matter the sacrifice. This ancestral mandate weighed heavily on Jonathan as he pondered his legacy. He had considered taking another wife. Several prominent families discreetly inquired about their eligible daughters. Yet Jonathan recoiled at the thought of sharing power with another strong-willed woman like Catherine. He had grown accustomed to absolute control over every facet of his estate, and the idea of compromising with a new wife, one who brought her own connections and opinions, repelled him. Even more troubling was the issue of loyalty. Any bride would inevitably bring her family's interests into the union, threatening the singular focus on the Caldwell legacy. Jonathan didn't want a partner. He needed a tool, someone fully aligned with his will, dependent on his protection and bound to him by ties stronger than any legal contract. It was in this atmosphere of cold calculation and ancestral pressure that destiny, or perhaps deliberate design, brought Elizabeth Hartwell into his life. November rain lashed against the windows of Millhaven's grand house as a gathering storm began to swell. Jonathan sat in his richly paneled walnut study, scrutinizing shipping records by the light of 3 silver candelabra, elegant French pieces that had belonged to Catherine. The room mirrored his personality, immaculate, controlled, and exact. Every book was in its place, each paper filed according to his system, every surface gleaming under the servant's relentless polishing. The plantation's ledgers told a story of astonishing prosperity. The tobacco yield had surpassed expectations. The French contracts were more lucrative than predicted, and his real estate ventures in Richmond had positioned him among the wealthiest men in Virginia. And yet a restless thought gnawed at him, the awareness that without a secure plan for the future, all of it could crumble. Close to midnight, his overseer, Samuel Bigham, appeared at the door. A wiry, weathered man, Bigham had served the Caldwells for over 2 decades, first under Jonathan's father, and now under Jonathan himself. His loyalty was unwavering, his discretion unquestioned, and his ability to execute difficult orders proven many times over. "Master Caldwell," Bigham said, his tone unusually grave, catching Jonathan's attention instantly. "There's been an accident on the Richmond Road. A carriage overturned in the storm. Seems to be quality folk, sir." Jonathan deliberately set down his quill. Quality folk meant responsibility, but also potentially opportunity. "How far?" he asked. "About 2 miles near Devil's Elbow, where the road bends around the creek," Bigham replied. "The driver's dead, sir. The gentleman and lady were thrown clear when it rolled. Didn't survive. The horses bolted, but we managed to recover the luggage." "Any survivors?" "A child, sir, a girl. Maybe 10 or 11. She was tossed into the bushes, likely what saved her. She keeps asking for her Uncle Thomas, but she's in shock. Doesn't recall much else." Jonathan's mind began working swiftly. Orphaned children from wealthy families could create unusual advantages for a man with resources and influence. "Did you find any identification? Papers, letters, anything that might reveal who they were?" Bigham's face shifted into a deliberately neutral expression, one Jonathan immediately recognized as his overseer's way of signaling that he had discovered something better discussed in private. "Found some papers in the gentleman's coat, sir," Bigham said carefully. "Name appears to be William Hartwell. He was traveling with his wife, Margaret, and their daughter. They had quite a large amount of gold with them, payment for land they intended to buy out in the Kentucky territories." The mention of gold piqued Jonathan's interest at once, but it was the measured tone in Bigham's voice that truly caught his attention. There was more to the story, something unspoken, something meant for a private exchange. "Bring the child here at once," Jonathan ordered. "Make sure she's cleaned up, given dry clothes, and fed properly. And Samuel—" He paused, locking eyes with his overseer in silent understanding. "We'll speak further about the other details of this unfortunate incident once she's settled." An hour later, when Jonathan entered the guest bedroom, the sight before him etched itself permanently into his memory. The girl sat perched on the edge of a 4-poster bed that had belonged to his grandmother, dressed in a nightgown that Martha, the head house servant, had provided. Despite the trauma she had endured, there was something unmistakably refined in her demeanor. The way her hands rested folded in her lap, the careful enunciation of her words as she thanked Martha for the warm milk, the quality of the silk dress drying by the fire. But what seized Jonathan's attention was her face. She bore an uncanny resemblance to his late wife, Catherine. The same delicate jawline, the same expressive eyes. When her freshly washed hair dried, it revealed the same deep chestnut shade that Catherine's had been. And when she looked up at him with those large, dark eyes, Jonathan felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, a sharp intake of breath. "What is your name, child?" Jonathan asked softly, lowering himself into the room's single chair so he could meet her gaze at eye level. "Elizabeth Hartwell," she whispered, her refined accent betraying her upbringing. "My parents, are they truly gone?" Samuel said there was an accident, but I thought maybe. Her unfinished question lingered in the air like smoke curling from a dying fire. Jonathan studied her face closely, not only for the resemblance to Catherine, but for the intelligence glimmering in her eyes, even through her grief. This was no ordinary orphan, no peasant girl who could disappear without notice. She was educated, well-bred, and of clear social standing, someone who would normally be sought after if she vanished. But here she was, alone, vulnerable and entirely dependent on him. "I'm afraid so, my dear," Jonathan answered gently, placing a hand on hers in a gesture that seemed paternal. "But you're safe now. Tomorrow we'll make inquiries about this Uncle Thomas you mentioned. We'll find your relatives and ensure you're properly cared for." Even as he spoke these words of comfort, his mind was already racing ahead, calculating possibilities that would have chilled any decent man. This was no ordinary opportunity. It was extraordinary. "Thank you, sir," Elizabeth said earnestly, her natural politeness shining despite her exhaustion. "You're very kind to take me in. I don't know what I would have done if your man hadn't found me." Jonathan smiled, warm and reassuring, concealing the scheming thoughts beneath. "Think nothing of it, my dear. It's our Christian duty to aid those in need, and I have a feeling you and I will become quite well acquainted." That night, as Elizabeth slept in the guest room under Martha's watchful eye, Jonathan convened with Samuel Bigum in the wine cellar, a space chosen for its isolation and the certainty that their conversation would remain unheard. What passed between them in that dim stone chamber would set in motion a chain of events of unimaginable consequence. The first letter Jonathan drafted, supposedly inquiring after Elizabeth's kin, was never mailed. Instead, it joined a growing collection of secret documents in a locked drawer in his study, records that painted a very different picture than the one he showed to neighbors and local officials. Through deliberate investigation, Jonathan discovered that Elizabeth's parents, William and Margaret Hartwell, had indeed been traveling west to visit relatives when tragedy struck, but those relatives lived in isolated mountain settlements near the Kentucky border, places so remote that communication was scarce and could take months over treacherous wilderness roads. Moreover, the Hartwells were relatively new to Virginia, having relocated from Maryland only 5 years earlier to build a small but thriving shipping business in Norfolk. Their social circle was limited, their ties fragile, and their sudden disappearance would most likely be attributed to the dangers of frontier travel rather than suspicion. Within a month, Jonathan executed an elaborate deception that demonstrated both his brilliance and his moral void. Presenting himself before the county clerk as Elizabeth's appointed guardian, he carried forged documents stating that her Uncle Thomas had recently died of fever in the Kentucky wilderness, just weeks before the carriage accident. The timing of the forged death was carefully calculated, tragic enough to stir sympathy, recent enough to explain the lack of correspondence, and distant enough to make any verification unlikely. As Virginia society's only local connection to the orphaned child, Jonathan portrayed himself as a benevolent figure, offering to raise her as his ward. It was an act that bolstered his reputation as a pious gentleman while serving his private ambitions. The county clerk, overwhelmed by post-war administrative chaos and impressed by Jonathan's standing, accepted the documents without question, making his guardianship official. The transition that followed was gradual and meticulously staged. Traumatized and isolated, Elizabeth began to accept Jonathan as her protector. He hired Miss Adelaide Fenwick, an educated Richmond spinster, to tutor her, ensuring her refinement continued while keeping her exposure to the outside world minimal. She was treated kindly by the household, dressed elegantly, surrounded by books, and slowly shaped into exactly what Jonathan envisioned. But his designs extended far beyond simple guardianship. In the winter of 1778, Jonathan traveled to Richmond to lay the legal groundwork for his ultimate plan. In the refined offices of his lawyer, Cornelius Vance, he executed a series of daring legal maneuvers. Vance, discreet and practiced in serving Virginia's powerful elite, was a short, tidy man with thinning gray hair and the soft hands of someone who had never labored. His firm specialized in the complex legal frameworks of inheritance, property, and marriage, fields perfectly suited to Jonathan's ambitions. First, Vance drafted adoption papers, legally making Elizabeth Jonathan's daughter and heir to Mill Haven, should he leave no other descendants. The documents were precise, binding her inheritance to him in a way that seemed both generous and above suspicion. To outsiders, it appeared a noble act from a childless widower providing for an orphan. Second, and far more audacious, Vance drew up a marriage contract between Jonathan Caldwell of Mill Haven and an unnamed, suitably bred and educated young woman to be determined at a future time. The vague language, indefinite timeline, and omitted identity were intentional. Vance, well paid for his silence, did not object. Such arrangements, while unusual, weren't entirely unheard of among Virginia's elite, who often negotiated marriages years in advance to consolidate fortunes. The adoption papers were filed publicly. The marriage contract, however, remained locked in Vance's private files, awaiting the right moment. As Elizabeth matured within the carefully managed confines of Mill Haven, Jonathan's control over her education grew increasingly focused and intense, shaping her future to fit a design only he fully understood. She studied French under a private tutor, Latin from the local minister, mathematics and literature from Miss Fenwick, and learned the intricacies of household management through closely observing Martha's work. She mastered the social refinements expected of a plantation mistress, the elaborate customs of Virginia high society, and the practical knowledge required to maintain a profitable estate. To outsiders, Jonathan's efforts appeared to be those of a conscientious guardian preparing his adopted daughter for a suitable marriage, perhaps to a younger son of a distinguished family in need of property, or an ambitious merchant seeking status through the Caldwell name. His commitment to her education was praised, his fatherly care admired, and his plans for her future regarded as both respectable and wise. Yet beneath this surface lay other lessons, subtle manipulations that began long before Elizabeth could comprehend their meaning. Jonathan often emphasized unwavering family loyalty, the sacred bonds that surpassed ordinary societal expectations, and biblical examples of unconventional family structures serving divine purposes. He recounted stories of patriarchs with multiple wives and complex lineages that safeguarded their heritage in perilous times. He frequently invoked Caldwell family history, recounting the sacrifices of ancestors who defended their land, made difficult choices to ensure survival, and upheld the sacred duty owed to both past and future generations. Over time, he began to impress upon Elizabeth that she held a unique place in this lineage. She was more than an adopted daughter. She was central to preserving the Caldwell legacy. Her intelligence suited her for managing affairs. Her beauty would enhance the family's reputation, and her loyalty could be shaped to prioritize legacy over personal will. By 1782, at 16, Elizabeth had grown into a strikingly intelligent and beautiful young woman. The psychological structure Jonathan had crafted around her was nearly complete. Isolated from peers and repeatedly reminded that her destiny was bound to the Caldwell lineage, she had been carefully conditioned to view Jonathan not merely as guardian, but as the guiding force of her existence and future. The final stage of his design unfolded in the spring of 1784 when Jonathan told her of a distant cousin who sought to arrange a marriage that would reunite two Caldwell branches and secure the estate's continuity. The proposal, he explained, was the culmination of years of deliberate planning, ensuring her future while honoring her duty to the family that raised her. Her first introduction to her intended husband came through a finely painted miniature portrait presented in Jonathan's study on a warm April morning. The portrait, enclosed in a lavish gold frame, depicted a man with features astonishingly similar to Jonathan's: strong jawline, piercing dark eyes, and an aura of quiet command that radiated from the painting. "His name is Jonathan Caldwell," her adoptive father stated evenly as he observed her reaction. He explained that this cousin from the western counties was of respectable character and considerable means, having established a thriving tobacco enterprise in the mountains. Their marriage, he said, would unify family assets and safeguard Mill Haven for generations to come. Elizabeth examined the portrait with growing unease, noting its formal, slightly dated style and, above all, the uncanny resemblance to Jonathan himself. "But his name is the same as yours, Papa," she remarked, recalling their family's naming traditions. Jonathan's reply was deceptively simple and chillingly effective. The cousin, he said, had been named after the same ancestor, a common practice to honor forebears and preserve connections. This Western cousin had wealth but lacked the refinement and influence of established Richmond society. Their union would grant him status while ensuring Elizabeth's role as preserver of the estate. Jonathan's persuasive rhetoric flowed effortlessly. The cousin would gain social access, Elizabeth would secure her future, and the Caldwell wealth would remain intact. "But I would be leaving you," Elizabeth said, her distress genuine, something Jonathan had carefully cultivated over the years. "Not leaving, my dear," he replied gently, masking satisfaction beneath paternal warmth. "Expanding our family." He assured her the arrangement was designed so she would never be far from him, with her husband spending ample time at Mill Haven to manage the joint estates. Preparations began at once, though unlike the extravagant weddings typical of Virginia's plantation elite, with their grand ceremonies, lengthy festivities, and extensive guest lists, Elizabeth's wedding would be a private affair held at Mill Haven with only select witnesses. Jonathan justified this unusual secrecy with practical and social excuses: scattered families after the war, dangerous travel conditions, the groom's family's preference for simplicity, and the appropriateness of restraint given Elizabeth's orphan status. As autumn approached, Elizabeth grew increasingly unsettled by inconsistencies in the arrangements. Despite her deference to Jonathan, she noticed that no replies arrived to the wedding invitations Jonathan claimed to have sent to the groom's kin and distant Caldwell relations. When she asked to see the responses, he told her that his lawyer in Richmond was handling all correspondence to spare her unnecessary burdens. When she requested to write to her intended husband, a reasonable wish, Jonathan claimed the man was traveling in the Western Territories and valued traditional distance before marriage, framing this as respectful and sincere. Most disquieting were the legal documents brought to Mill Haven in September by Cornelius Vance. Arriving with boxes of paperwork, Vance presented Elizabeth with inheritance deeds, marriage settlements, and documents outlining the merger of Caldwell properties. When she tried to read them, both men dismissed her concerns, saying the legal language was far too complex for her to understand. Vance, with practiced professionalism, assured her these were standard legal formalities designed to protect her rights as both heir and bride, already negotiated by Jonathan and himself for her benefit. One document in particular drew Elizabeth's eye: a property deed that appeared to transfer her inheritance rights as Jonathan's adopted daughter to someone else entirely. When she brought up her concerns about this unsettling development, Jonathan responded with a polished and well-prepared explanation. He told her that once she was married, her legal designation would shift from being his daughter to becoming the daughter-in-law of the Caldwell family, and the documents merely reflected this transition, while preserving her future inheritance rights. However, Jonathan had underestimated Elizabeth's intelligence. Despite his years of manipulation and control, the education he had provided had given her enough insight into legal matters and property law to sense that something about these documents was deeply suspicious. The wording felt intentionally complex, the process was being hurried along, and his answers seemed designed to silence her inquiries rather than genuinely inform her. Late at night, alone in her bedroom, Elizabeth began to assemble the pieces of a puzzle that would expose the dreadful truth of her situation. It all began to unravel on a chilly October evening. Struggling with pre-wedding nerves and a growing sense of unease about the legal documents Jonathan had prepared, she wandered to his study in search of a book of poetry, assuming he had retired for the night. The large house was still, filled only with the creaks of old wood settling and the faint whisper of wind through bare branches outside. Instead of finding the study empty, she saw Jonathan awake and working by candlelight, poring over neatly arranged documents on his mahogany desk. The room glowed under 3 silver candelabras, their flames casting flickering shadows over shelves of leather-bound books and stern ancestral portraits that seemed to watch her every move. As Elizabeth stepped forward to announce herself, Her eyes fell upon something that froze her blood. Among the papers lay a miniature portrait of her supposed future husband. Next to it was a small mirror, positioned so Jonathan could compare his reflection with the image. Even more chilling, she saw him making subtle adjustments to his hair and facial expression, mimicking the portrait's pose. She slipped away silently, heart pounding so loudly she feared he might hear it. Her mind raced to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The resemblance between Jonathan and the man in the portrait was not mere coincidence. It was exact because they were the same man. But how could this be possible? What kind of elaborate scheme had he constructed? The realization that slowly formed in her mind was so horrific she struggled to accept it. It explained every strange detail surrounding the wedding. There was no cousin. There had never been one. Jonathan planned to marry her himself under a fabricated identity, creating the illusion of legitimacy while maintaining his role as her adoptive father. In the days that followed, Elizabeth launched her own quiet investigation, using the analytical and observational abilities Jonathan himself had drilled into her during her education. She began by examining household correspondence, taking advantage of brief moments during lessons with Miss Fenwick or conversations with Martha about the wedding to review letters unnoticed. What she uncovered confirmed her deepest fears. No letters existed from any cousin named Jonathan Caldwell. Instead, there were messages from Cornelius Vance discussing special legal preparations and emphasizing strict discretion regarding the unusual nature of the ceremony. She also discovered bills from a portrait artist in Richmond for alterations to existing miniatures and receipts for clothing and accessories clearly intended to modify someone's appearance. Her breakthrough came when she located a locked drawer in Jonathan's study while he was away on a business trip to Richmond. Using a hairpin and the lock-picking trick she had learned from watching Martha make household repairs, she managed to open it during a busy afternoon, when no one would question her presence in the study. Inside, she found evidence that exposed the full extent of Jonathan's deception. There were unsent inquiry letters about her parents, forged guardianship papers granting him control over her, fabricated correspondence supposedly from the non-existent cousin, expressing enthusiasm for the marriage, and, most damning of all, Jonathan's handwritten notes laying out his plans for their wedding night and their future together. But the marriage contract was the most shocking of all. Drafted in Vance's meticulous legal handwriting, it named the groom as Jonathan Caldwell of Millhaven Estate, Henrico County, and the bride as Elizabeth Hartwell, legally adopted daughter of Jonathan Caldwell. There was no mention of any cousin. The groom and adoptive father were openly declared to be one and the same. This revelation struck Elizabeth like a surge of icy water. She trembled with nausea as she sat in Jonathan's chair, reading the documents that defined her fate with cold, methodical precision. Every affectionate gesture, every lesson, every act of paternal care had been calculated to lead to this moment. She had been groomed from childhood to become not only his heir but also his wife, destined to be both his daughter and bride, ensuring that his lineage continued unbroken and his estate remained fully under his command. The most terrifying element of the scheme was its legal intricacy and the complete powerlessness it imposed upon her. By adopting her first, Jonathan had secured both his paternal authority and her inheritance rights. By marrying her afterward, he would maintain control of the estate while guaranteeing that any children born from their union would be legitimate heirs to the Caldwell fortune. In the complex, post-revolutionary Virginia legal landscape, where property, bloodlines, and social standing carried immense weight, Jonathan's plan was appalling but not necessarily unlawful. Even more disturbing were his notes about the years to come. He had reasoned that their age difference and his established reputation would allow them to present themselves as a typical married couple in other regions. The adoption records would remain filed but unspoken of, while the marriage certificate would list only their names without reference to their prior relationship. Any children would grow up believing Jonathan was simply their father, never learning their mother's true origins. That night, Elizabeth lay awake plotting her escape. But as dawn crept in, she was struck by a devastating truth. She had nowhere to run and no means to support herself. Jonathan had isolated her completely. She had no companions her age, no family contacts who might aid her, and no wealth or property of her own. Even if she tried to expose him, the very documents that detailed his plan were designed to make her appear as a willing participant. The wedding date, November 15th, was only 3 weeks away. Time was slipping away and Jonathan's trap was nearly flawless. Her opportunity came unexpectedly with the arrival of a stranger. On November 3rd, a traveling minister named Reverend Thomas Hartley arrived at Millhaven Estate, seeking lodging for the night as he journeyed between Virginia parishes. His surname made Elizabeth's heart pound with a mix of dread and hope. Could he be linked to her true family? Reverend Hartley was around 50, with gray-streaked hair and weathered skin that told of years spent traveling rough country roads. His modest clothing reflected his humble status, but his demeanor carried the quiet authority of a man respected in every community he served. During dinner, he spoke with ease about Virginia's families, drawn from years of officiating baptisms, weddings, and funerals across the Commonwealth. As they dined beneath portraits of Caldwell ancestors in Millhaven's formal dining room, Elizabeth listened closely to his stories about frontier settlements, isolated plantations, and the challenges of ministering to people scattered across vast wilderness. When Jonathan stepped out to give Samuel Bigham instructions about guest accommodations, Elizabeth seized the moment. "Reverend Hartley," she asked in a carefully controlled voice despite the storm of emotions inside her, "might you know a family called Hartwell? I believe they may have been distant relations of mine." The minister's lined face brightened warmly with recognition. "Indeed I did, child. William and Margaret Hartwell. A tragic loss, that carriage accident years ago. They were good, devout people who often attended my services in Norfolk. They spoke fondly of their daughter, Elizabeth, a bright young girl they planned to take to live with Margaret's brother in Kentucky after completing some business in the West." Hearing this confirmation of facts Jonathan had claimed were unverifiable nearly shattered Elizabeth's composure. "Her brother, not her uncle," Reverend Hartley corrected gently. "Brother Thomas, yes. Thomas Whitfield was his name, though Margaret had chosen to keep her maiden name Hartwell after marrying. It wasn't unusual in families where the woman brought significant property into the marriage. The last I heard, Thomas was running a trading post near Harrisburg. He was still awaiting news of his sister's family, and had grown increasingly concerned when they failed to arrive for their planned meeting." "Why do you ask, my child?" Before Elizabeth could speak, Jonathan returned to the dining room and the conversation shifted back to more ordinary topics. But she had already heard enough to solidify her darkest fears, and to uncover something extraordinary. She had living relatives, real family, and the Uncle Thomas Jonathan had claimed was dead was in truth Margaret's brother. He bore a completely different surname and, far from being deceased, was alive and actively seeking news of his sister's fate. That night, Elizabeth resolved to take a course of action that would demand every ounce of intelligence and bravery she possessed. She would face Jonathan directly, not to plead for mercy or bargain for her freedom, but to collect the evidence she needed to expose his crimes to Reverend Hartley. If she could persuade the minister to bring word of her situation to the authorities in Richmond, there was a chance to escape the trap that had ensnared her for the past 13 years. Waiting until the house had gone still, she moved through the dark halls toward Jonathan's study, where she knew he often stayed up reviewing correspondence and estate records. As expected, she found him inside, immersed in preparations for their wedding. The forged documents spread before him with the precision of a general organizing a campaign. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway in her white nightgown and wrapper, his expression shifted from surprise to something far more dangerous, a look of icy calculation that made her acutely aware of how utterly alone she was with a man capable of unspeakable violence. "Elizabeth," he said in a calm, deliberate tone, setting down his quill with care, "you should be sleeping. Tomorrow we have many arrangements to complete for our wedding ceremony." The way he emphasized "our" sent a shiver down her spine, but she steadied herself. "There is no cousin," she replied, her voice firm despite the terror coursing through her. "There never was. You plan to marry me yourself." Jonathan's carefully crafted mask of paternal warmth finally shattered completely, revealing the predatory figure that had always lurked beneath. The transformation was absolute and chilling. Any trace of fatherly affection vanished, replaced by the calculating stare of a man whose elaborate scheme had been uncovered but who was still confident in his control. "You are more perceptive than I expected," he said, slowly rising from his chair. His tall figure cast long shadows in the candlelight, and Elizabeth was struck by how physically helpless she was against him. Yes, there is no cousin. And yes, in 12 days you will become my wife. You will also remain my daughter, my heir, and the mother of the children who will continue the Caldwell line. It is an arrangement that benefits everyone. Everyone's interests but mine, Elizabeth answered, astonished by the strength in her own voice as she stood up to him. Jonathan's smile was glacial, utterly devoid of warmth. Your interests are my interests, Elizabeth. They have been since the night I found you, orphaned and alone on the road to Richmond. Do you imagine your rescue was coincidence? That I raised, educated, and provided for you out of mere Christian kindness? His words struck her like a physical blow, confirming suspicions she had hardly dared to face. The carriage accident, she whispered. You knew about it. I arranged it, Jonathan said with the casual air of someone commenting on the weather. Your parents were carrying a large sum of money, payment for land they intended to buy in Kentucky. My men were ordered to intercept the carriage and secure the funds. You were a surprise bonus. When I saw your striking resemblance to my beloved Catherine, I recognized that Providence had delivered me something far more precious than gold. In that instant, the entire nightmare crystallized for Elizabeth with horrifying clarity. Her parents' deaths had not been the result of some tragic accident. They had been murdered under Jonathan's orders for their wealth. She had not been rescued, she had been kidnapped. Her entire existence for the past 13 years had been built on lies, violence, and calculated grooming for purposes so monstrous they defied belief. The law will not allow this, Elizabeth said, even though she knew deep down the futility of invoking legal protections in a society where women held almost no rights outside of male authority. Jonathan laughed, genuinely amused, the sound echoing through the room lined with law books and portraits of stern ancestors. The law, my dear, is exactly what men like me shape it to be. You are legally my daughter, which grants me total authority over you until marriage. You will then legally become my wife, keeping you under my control forever. Every document is properly executed, witnessed by men of standing, and filed with the courts. There is no legal power in Virginia or anywhere else that can touch us. He stepped closer as he spoke, and she could smell the brandy on his breath. His eyes glittered with cold satisfaction as he savored what he believed was his absolute triumph over her will and her future. More to the point, he continued, you have no allies and no refuge. Your dear Uncle Thomas believes you perished with your parents 13 years ago. You have no friends, no wealth, no connections to anyone who could aid you. Even if you did escape Mill Haven, you would be a destitute orphan with no proof of identity and no means to survive. But Jonathan had failed to account for one vital element. Elizabeth's desperation was matched by over a decade of education and sharp observation. She had learned not only academic subjects, but how to read people, discern motives, and detect vulnerabilities. And she had pinpointed his greatest flaw, his towering pride in his own intellect. You're right, she said softly, letting resignation seep into her tone. I have no choice but to accept your plan. But I want to understand. How did you know my parents would be traveling that road with so much money? How could you set up such a flawless ambush? His expression changed to one of smug satisfaction, mistaking her question for surrender. Like many cunning criminals, he couldn't resist flaunting the ingenuity of his scheme to someone capable of appreciating its intricacy. Your father was a fool, he said, leaning back in his chair with the self-satisfied air of a man savoring his achievements. He spoke too freely in Norfolk taverns, bragging about his land purchase in Kentucky. It wasn't difficult to learn his travel plans, the route he would take, and the amount of gold he'd be carrying. From there, everything fell into place. As Jonathan elaborated on the months of planning behind her parents' murder and her abduction, Elizabeth mentally recorded every word. She possessed no weapon, no way to overpower him physically, but she held a far more potent tool. A credible witness sleeping upstairs, a man of the cloth with moral authority and the power to persuade magistrates and courts. What followed would become the subject of whispered tales throughout Henrico County for generations to come. A story that wove together justice, vengeance, and divine intervention in a way that defied easy explanation. On the morning of November 15th, 1789, the day intended to consummate Jonathan's monstrous plot, Mill Haven Estate descended into turmoil. The events of that day would shatter the Caldwell family forever and expose the buried secrets of 13 years. Elizabeth's strategy was simple in concept, but devastating in execution. Shaped by 13 years of rigorous education and born of sheer necessity, she had spent the previous 12 days not in quiet submission, but in meticulous preparation. drawing upon every skill Jonathan had ever imparted to her. Using her deep familiarity with the household's daily routines, her unrestricted access to Jonathan's study during his regular plantation rounds, and her sharp understanding of the legal and financial systems he had manipulated to sustain his deception, Elizabeth carefully assembled incriminating evidence against him. The proof she collected was vast in scale and damning in detail. She meticulously duplicated the forged guardianship papers that granted Jonathan control over her, the counterfeit letters supposedly from the imaginary cousin, the financial records, revealing payments to the men who had attacked the Hartwell carriage, and most damning of all, Jonathan's personal notes detailing his intentions for their marriage and the children he expected her to bear. But Elizabeth knew that documents alone could not dismantle the power of a man with Jonathan's wealth, influence, and social standing. She needed something more powerful, public exposure supported by unimpeachable witnesses whose testimony could not be ignored or suppressed. She had to ensure that Jonathan's crimes were revealed in a way that eliminated any possibility of denial. The wedding was to be held in Millhaven's Great Hall, with Reverend Charles Peaton presiding over a select assembly of guests. Cornelius, Vance, local magistrates, prominent members of Richmond society, neighboring plantation owners, and their wives. To this audience, the occasion would appear to be nothing more than the unusual, but not unheard of marriage of a wealthy guardian to his adopted daughter. An arrangement driven by property concerns rather than personal choice, as was common in their society. Elizabeth appeared in her wedding gown, a dress of ivory silk once worn by Jonathan's late wife, Catherine, now altered to fit her slighter figure. Though pale, she carried herself with composed grace. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate, pearl-adorned style befitting Virginia's elite, the pearls themselves once Catherine's bridal jewelry. To the assembled guests, she looked like a nervous but dutiful bride, resigned to the expectations of the day. Jonathan stood beside her, dressed in his most elegant attire, a deep midnight blue coat, a buff-colored waistcoat, and a crisp white stock that enhanced his commanding presence. His self-satisfaction was unmistakable, radiating from his posture as he prepared to secure an unprecedented triumph, a marriage that would protect his estate, perpetuate his bloodline, and maintain his social rank while shattering every moral code of civilized society. Reverend Peaton, a venerable minister with over 30 years of service among Virginia's plantation elite, began the ceremony with the solemn words that had united countless couples. His voice carried the full weight of religious authority, extolling the sacred nature of marriage, the responsibilities of husband and wife, and the divine blessing bestowed upon Christian unions. As the ritual unfolded in its familiar cadence, the guests relaxed into the comfort of tradition. It was, to their eyes, just another plantation wedding, unusual in arrangement, but conventional in structure. When Reverend Peaton reached the customary question regarding lawful impediments, Elizabeth's clear voice rang through the hall, slicing through the ceremonial atmosphere. "I must confess a deception before God and these witnesses," she declared. "I am not Elizabeth Caldwell, adopted daughter of Jonathan Caldwell. I am Elizabeth Hartwell, and this man murdered my parents to steal their gold and kidnapped me for the purpose you witnessed today." Chaos erupted instantly. Jonathan tried to suppress her words, dismissing them as nervous hysteria typical of young brides, but Elizabeth had prepared for this moment with the precision of an attorney ready for trial. She produced the stolen documents, handing them to Reverend Peaton and the witnesses with composed deliberation, making it impossible to dismiss her accusations as emotional outbursts. As the gathered men examined the papers, men versed in law and finance, the magnitude of Jonathan's crimes became indisputable. There were the forged guardianship documents with expertly falsified signatures, the letters planning her parents' murder written in Jonathan's own hand, the payment records to Samuel Bigham and others for their role in the attack, and the detailed notes chronicling his years of grooming her for this ultimate act. All of it was documented with the precision of a man too arrogant to imagine discovery. Then Elizabeth revealed one final truth that would forever seal Jonathan's fate. "There is one more crime you must hear," she announced steadily. Catherine Caldwell did not die in childbirth as you've been told. I found her diary hidden in the basement, along with letters from Dr. Marcus Fleming of Richmond describing symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. She was poisoned by her husband when she threatened to expose his affairs with enslaved women. The revelation of spousal murder, added to the kidnapping and parental killings, detonated a scandal so immense that not even Jonathan's fortune and connections could contain it. Several magistrates present recognized the evidence's validity and immediately ordered his arrest pending a formal inquiry. His attempts to claim misunderstanding and accuse Elizabeth of madness fell flat. The subsequent trial became one of the most sensational cases in early Virginia history, drawing attention from newspapers across the colonies. Jonathan's defense relied on attacking Elizabeth's sanity and alleging forged evidence, but the overwhelming proof in her composed testimony crushed his claims. His former allies quickly distanced themselves from the disgraced man. The prosecution portrayed him as the embodiment of calculated evil, a murderer, kidnapper, and manipulator who had groomed a child for exploitation while cloaking himself in Christian respectability. Jonathan was convicted on multiple counts: the murders of William and Margaret Hartwell, kidnapping and false imprisonment of Elizabeth, fraud through forged documents, and the murder of his wife, Catherine. His sentence was death by hanging, carried out publicly in Richmond on March 15, 1790, before many who had once courted his favor. Elizabeth, now the rightful heir to his estate as his legal daughter and surviving victim, used her inheritance to journey west and locate her uncle, Thomas Whitfield, in the Kentucky territories. The journey lasted 3 months and required the escort of federal marshals, but at its end, Elizabeth successfully located her uncle, who was still running his trading post near Harrodsburg. Clinging to the hope of hearing news about his lost kin, their reunion overflowed with tears and joy. Yet Elizabeth bore wounds that time would never completely mend. She had endured 13 years of psychological manipulation and narrowly evaded a fate more horrific than death itself. These experiences reshaped her profoundly. She emerged with a hard-earned awareness of human depravity and a steadfast resolve to protect other children from enduring similar horrors. Although she received many marriage proposals from men drawn to her beauty, intellect, and considerable fortune, Elizabeth chose never to wed. The thought of legally placing herself under a man's authority was too frightening, too evocative of the trap she had barely escaped. Instead, she dedicated her life and wealth to founding schools for orphans throughout Kentucky and Virginia, safe havens where vulnerable children could be educated and safeguarded rather than exploited by those pretending to act in their interest. Her institutions became pioneering models for child welfare in the growing nation, emphasizing both education and legal safeguards for orphans, along with thorough background checks for anyone seeking to adopt or employ them. Her work directly influenced the creation of legal frameworks that would go on to protect countless children for decades. Elizabeth passed away in 1847 at the age of 81, surrounded by many of the hundreds of children whose lives she had uplifted through her work. Governors, senators, and notable citizens from across the country attended her funeral, honoring a woman who turned personal tragedy into a lifetime of public service. Mill Haven Estate was liquidated to cover legal debts and compensate victims, its once grand house left abandoned for years before being demolished. Local tales claimed that the soil where the estate had stood became barren, crops refusing to flourish and animals shunning the fields where Jonathan had plotted his crimes. For more than a century, the land remained untouched until it became part of a state forest. Even today, visitors can find the old foundation stones, though few realize the darkness they once supported. The Caldwell name vanished entirely from Virginia's social circles. Extended relatives altered their surnames or moved away, unwilling to carry the stain of Jonathan's legacy. The family's once unshakable social status crumbled in a single generation, a reminder that even the most carefully curated facades of respectability cannot survive the light of truth. Jonathan's overseer, Samuel Bigham, who aided in the murders, was tried separately and executed by hanging 6 months after his employer. Cornelius Vance, the lawyer who orchestrated legal manipulations, was disbarred and fled the state, only to be captured later and imprisoned for fraud and conspiracy. The case became a foundational cautionary tale in law schools and theological seminaries, a stark example of how corruption and abuse thrive when society fails to shield its most defenseless. Elizabeth's bravery in revealing the truth despite immense personal danger and Jonathan's formidable power inspired reformers who sought legal protections for women and children. This story lays bare how evil can cloak itself in respectability and social standing, how the vulnerable can be preyed upon by those claiming to protect them, and how intelligence and courage can ultimately dismantle even the most meticulously engineered wickedness. Elizabeth Hartwell's relentless pursuit of justice not only saved her own life but stopped Jonathan Caldwell from harming others and laid the groundwork for protections that would safeguard generations of children. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you believe such intricate schemes and systemic abuse could truly occur in the chaotic legal environment of post-revolutionary America? How do you think Elizabeth found the strength to risk everything by confronting Jonathan's crimes with no assurance she would be believed or aided? Share your thoughts below about how one woman's determination and intellect brought down a seemingly untouchable predator who hid his evil behind wealth and social status. If you enjoyed this chilling historical account, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our weekly explorations of America's darkest mysteries. And don't forget to share this story with someone who appreciates tales where bravery triumphs over calculated evil. Until next time, remember, the most terrifying monsters often wear the masks of civility, and true heroes are often those who refuse to remain silent in the face of unimaginable injustice.